there, this is Elle, and there are 4 different techniques to making HSTs. 1, 2, 4, and 8 at a time. Making a HST 1 at a time is similar to snowballing a square, but instead there are 2 squares of equal size. If this doesn't make sense, don't worry, I will show you. To start, like I said, you need 2 squares of equal size. On one of the squares, a diagonal guideline needs to be drawn. I like to pin parallel to the line drawn. Now the big difference between 1 at a time HSTs and other methods is that the guideline is directly sewn on. Here I am sewing on that line. This is my least favorite method due to it creating a large amount of waste. Only one side of the HST is kept. To mitigate this, I sew a line next to the original line to create a scrap HST. Finally, I line up a ruler with the central line and measure a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and cut off the scrap HST. 2 at a time HSTs is a classic way to create HSTs. This method once again starts with a diagonal guideline being drawn on one of the pieces. And I pin them together. Instead of sewing on the line, 2 lines are sewn a 1/4 inch away from the guideline. I do recommend sewing at least 2 at a time, like I'm doing here. This is so they can be chain pieced and save thread. So, with everything pieced, I can move on to cutting. To separate the 2 HSTs sewn, I cut on the guideline. I tend to actually line up the 1/4 mark on my ruler with one of the sewn lines. After this, I just double check that I'll be cutting roughly on the drawn line. 4 at a time HSTs is a method to make more HSTs at once. It is different from other methods as no guidelines are drawn. Here, the squares are just put on top of each other and pinned together. I'm careful to make sure the pins stay away from the edges of the squares. Now I just sew down each side. Once again, I recommend doing more than 1 at a time. This is a very forgiving method that doesn't require the most accurate sewing. To start cutting, I match the edge of my ruler to 2 of the points and cut. This will generate 2 halves that will need to be cut again to get to the final HST. Each half gets cut the same way. I line up the edge of the ruler with the point on the half. Then line up the 45-degree line on the ruler with the edge of the half, and finally I make the cut. 8 at a time HSTs is the final method and allows for even more HSTs to be made at the same time. It's similar to the 2 at a time method, but has 2 diagonal lines instead. So, this method starts with drawing the 2 diagonal lines. Sewing 8 at a time is done using the same method as 2 at a time. The big difference here is that there are 2 lines that need a line stitched a 1/4 inch away on both sides. Like all the methods, I once again recommend sewing at least 2 sets at a time. Chain piecing is just such a useful technique. When done sewing, there will have been 4 lines sewn. The cutting process for 8 at a time is more involved than any of the other methods. I start off with cutting on the diagonal lines. First one on the full square. Lining up the edge of the ruler with the diagonal line on the 2 halves, I then cut on the final diagonal line. If this was the 4 at a time method, this would have been the stopping point. But the 8 at a time method still has 2 seams at this point that need to be cut apart. I once again use the method of lining up the 45-degree line on the ruler with the edge to get an accurate middle of the half. Now it doesn't matter what method you use to make a HST, it needs to be trimmed to be completely done. I have a special ruler I use to accomplish this. It is the Quilt in a Day Square Up ruler. This ruler has lines that match up to the unfinished size of the HST. Here I want a 2-inch unfinished HST, so I lie the 2-inch line on the seam. Next, I just trim around the ruler and snip off the tails and have a fully trimmed HST. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. This is the first long-form video I ever made and the first video where I actually use my own voice. Please let me know if y'all have any feedback down below in the comments. Once again, thank you so much for watching.